Between November 7th and 9th, 1982, 9 coal miners were eliminated across a remote hollow in McDowell County, West Virginia. All adults, all working men with families, all connected to a single shortcut through private land. The method was systematic, hunting rifles fired from distance, bear traps hidden on dark mountain roads, bodies disappearing into abandoned mine shafts that had swallowed men before. The perpetrators weren't rival mining companies or union enforcers or even drug runners fighting over territory. They were 4 members of the Harlow family, a father and his 3 sons who'd lived on that land for 127 years, moving through the mountains like ghosts, methodically eliminating everyone who'd crossed a line drawn in family blood. The West Virginia State Police would later call it one of the most calculated acts of rural violence in Appalachian history. But the motive wasn't territory, wasn't money, wasn't even a dispute over mineral rights. It was trespassing on a family cemetery that held 5 generations of Harlow dead, graves desecrated by tired men looking for a shortcut home after 16-hour shifts underground. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events. McDowell County, West Virginia, sprawled across 535 square miles of some of the most unforgiving terrain in the eastern United States in 1982. The mountains rose like ancient walls scarred by decades of strip mining, their peaks reaching over 4,000 feet, their valleys so narrow and steep that sunlight only touched the bottom for a few hours each day. Population stood around 50,000, down from over 100,000 in the boom years of the 1950s, when coal was king and men could make union wages working underground. November in these mountains meant temperatures dropping to the mid-20s at night, creeping up to maybe 45 by afternoon if you were lucky. The air smelled like sulfur from coal seams burning underground, sometimes for decades, mixed with wood smoke from stoves and the metallic tang of streams running orange with mine runoff. At night, when fog rolled down from the ridges, you could hear the wind moving through bare trees and the distant sound of something shifting deep underground, mountains collapsing into the empty spaces where coal used to be. But 1982 was a catastrophic year for coal country. The industry that had sustained these mountains for nearly a century was in free fall. Mechanization had eliminated thousands of jobs that used to require men with picks and shovels. Foreign coal imports undercut prices. Environmental regulations, though necessary, shut down operations that couldn't afford compliance. Companies were pulling out, declaring bankruptcy, leaving behind scarred mountains and families with no way to make a living. In McDowell County, unemployment hit 47% that fall, the highest in the nation. Men who'd spent their entire adult lives underground, breathing coal dust, risking cave-ins and explosions for union wages, now had nothing. No jobs, no prospects, no way to feed their families except food stamps that bought humiliation at the grocery store and disability checks that barely covered rent. The coal towns scattered through these mountains were dying. Welch, the county seat, had lost half its population since 1960. Gary, Kimball, War, Bradshaw, all emptying out as young people fled to Charlotte or Cincinnati or anywhere that offered futures their hometowns couldn't provide. What remained were the old people who'd lived here too long to leave and the desperate ones who had nowhere else to go. The roads through McDowell County were narrow two-lane affairs that curved along ridges and dropped into hollows with grades so steep you had to ride your brakes going down and floor the accelerator going up. Route 19 wound through the county like a snake, connecting dying towns, through mountain passes where rock faces rose vertical on one side and dropped away to nothing on the other. Most of the side roads weren't paved, just gravel or dirt that turned to mud when it rained and ice when winter came early. Cell phone service didn't exist yet. The nearest hospital was in Bluefield, 28 miles north, on roads that could take an hour to navigate in bad weather. State police coverage was theoretical at best, one barracks serving the entire county. Troopers spread so thin they might take 2 hours to respond to a call in the remote hollows. In places like McDowell County, the law was more suggestion than reality, and people still lived by older codes, mountain codes that said you settled your own problems because nobody else would. Thomas William Harlow was 58 years old that November, though he looked closer to 70. He stood 6 feet 3 inches tall but stooped forward slightly, a permanent bend in his spine. From decades of swinging an axe and hauling logs down mountain slopes where no machine could reach. His hands were massive, knuckles swollen with arthritis that got worse every winter, fingers scarred from chainsaw work and farming accidents that had never quite healed right. Deep lines carved through his face like water cutting through limestone. Decades of weather and worry etched into skin the color of old leather. A thick scar ran from behind his left ear down to his collarbone, souvenir from a logging accident in 1967 when a widowmaker branch fell 40 feet and nearly killed him. He walked with a slight limp, legacy of the same accident, and when the temperature dropped below freezing, that limp became pronounced enough that his youngest son had to help him up the porch steps. His beard was full and gray, though his hair still held streaks of the dark brown it had been in his youth. When he looked at you, his eyes were the color of coal smoke, gray and impenetrable, holding calculations you couldn't read. Every morning Thomas woke at 4:30 in the house his grandfather had built in 1897, made coffee in a percolator so old the bottom was worn thin, and sat at his kitchen table reading from a King James Bible his grandmother had given him in 1948. He'd read one chapter, drink his coffee, black and strong enough to strip paint, then step outside to watch the sun come up over the ridgeline. He'd smoke one cigarette, unfiltered Pall Mall rolled so tight it lasted 20 minutes, and then he'd start his day. Check the chickens, split firewood for the stove, walk the 200 yards up the hill to the family cemetery, where 5 generations of Harlows lay buried in ground that had been theirs since 1855. He'd married Elizabeth Ann Hendricks in 1949, right after he came home from Korea with nightmares and that scar. They'd had 4 children, 3 sons, Jacob, Matthew, Samuel, and 1 daughter, Sarah, who died at age 7 in 1971 from leukemia that the county hospital couldn't treat. Elizabeth herself had passed in 1977 from complications related to black lung disease, though she'd never worked in the mines, just breathed the air in a county where coal dust settled on everything. She was buried up the hill beside their daughter, beside Thomas's parents and grandparents and great-grandparents going back to the Civil War. What Thomas valued most wasn't the house or the 40 acres of steep mountainside his family had claimed over a century ago. What he valued was the covenant with the dead, the understanding that land isn't property you own, but sacred trust you protect. His great-great-grandfather, Isaiah Harlow, had settled this hollow in 1855 after walking from Virginia with his wife and 3 children, claiming land that nobody else wanted because it was too steep for farming, too remote for commerce. Isaiah had carved the first graves himself when his infant son died that first winter. By 1860, there were 4 Harlow graves on the ridge. By 1900, there were 16. Now, in 1982, there were 43 weathered headstones, marking the passage of 127 years of births and deaths, marriages and children. Lives lived in isolation, but never alone, because the dead were always present, always watching, always demanding that the living remember. Thomas's grandfather, William Harlow, had taught him that the cemetery was more than burial ground. It was the physical manifestation of family continuity, proof that Harlows had survived wars and depressions and mining company land grabs and government attempts to relocate them. In 1959, when Thomas was 35, the Blue Ridge Coal Company had tried to claim the hollow under eminent domain, arguing they needed access to a coal seam that ran underneath Harlow land. Thomas's father, Jacob Harlow Sr., had stood in front of the bulldozers with a shotgun and told them they'd have to kill him before touching one grave. The company backed down, not because they respected his rights, but because the cost of fighting wasn't worth the coal. Jacob had died 3 years later, heart attack at age 62, and Thomas buried him on the ridge between his own father and his infant sister, who died in 1923. Standing at that grave, Thomas had made a promise. No mining company, no government agency, no power on earth would ever touch this ground while he lived. The cemetery sat on a flat section of ridge 200 yards uphill from the house, surrounded by a low stone wall that Isaiah had built by hand over 2 summers in the 1860s. 43 graves, some marked with elaborate headstones, carved from local sandstone, others with simple wooden crosses that had to be replaced every decade as weather rotted them. The oldest graves were barely readable, names and dates worn smooth by rain and wind. But Thomas knew everyone by heart, could walk the cemetery blindfolded and tell you who was buried where, when they'd died, what they'd done in life. His daughter Sarah's grave was near the center, marked with a white marble headstone he'd bought with 3 months' wages from logging. The inscription read simply, Sarah Marie Harlow, 1964 to 1971, gone to God too soon. 14 feet away was Elizabeth's grave with a matching headstone. Thomas visited both every morning, spoke to them the way his grandfather had spoken to the older graves, maintaining the connection between living and dead that defined what it meant to be a Harlow. Thomas's 3 sons had inherited their father's understanding of what the land meant, though each carried that understanding differently. Jacob William Harlow, 32 that November, was the oldest and most like his father. He stood 6 feet 2 inches tall with his father's build, lean and ropey with muscle from physical labor. His face was weathered beyond his years, deep lines around his eyes from squinting into sun and smoke. He'd married young, at 19, to a girl named Rebecca from War, and they had 3 children now. Jacob worked as a logging foreman for Appalachian Timber, one of the few companies still operating in the county, overseeing crews that cut hardwood on steep mountainsides where mechanization was impossible. The work was dangerous, seasonal, and barely paid enough to support his family. But he stayed because leaving meant abandoning the hollow, and Harlows didn't abandon the hollow. Every Sunday he brought his children to the cemetery and taught them the names of ancestors they'd never met, the same way his father had taught him. Matthew Thomas Harlow, 29, was quieter than his older brother, but just as committed to the family obligation. He worked maintenance at a coal preparation plant in Welch, cleaning equipment and fixing machinery for $12 an hour when the plant was running, which was less and less frequently. He'd never married, lived in a small cabin he'd built himself on the lower section of the family property. Matthew was the one who maintained the cemetery, repairing headstones when they cracked, replacing wooden crosses when weather rotted them, keeping the stone wall in good repair. He'd taught himself masonry from library books and practiced on the cemetery until his work was as good as anything his great-great-grandfather had done. Matthew understood that physical maintenance was a form of prayer, that caring for the graves was caring for the covenant itself. He rarely spoke more than necessary, but his actions demonstrated devotion deeper than words could express. Samuel James Harlow, 26, was the youngest and the one who'd come closest to leaving. He'd graduated high school with decent grades, gotten accepted to West Virginia University in Morgantown, spent 1 semester studying forestry before his mother got sick. He'd come home to help care for her, watched her die slowly over 6 months, and never went back to school. Now he worked odd jobs, carpentry and electrical work, and anything else that needed doing in a county where everyone needed something fixed, but nobody had money to pay for proper repairs. Samuel had a girlfriend, Teresa, who worked at the hospital in Bluefield and wanted him to move there, get a real job, build a future somewhere with opportunity. But Samuel couldn't leave. Not because he lacked ambition, but because he understood that his father was getting older. His brothers had their own families, and someone needed to stay close, to be available when the old man needed help, climbing those porch steps, or walking up to the cemetery on mornings when arthritis made movement agony. The 3 brothers didn't talk much about their shared obligation. They didn't need to. They understood completely. The 9 miners who would die in Harlow Hollow weren't criminals, weren't troublemakers, weren't men who went looking for conflict. They were fathers and husbands, brothers and sons, trying to survive in an economy that had collapsed around them like a worked-out mine shaft. Dale Edward Pritchard was 41 years old that November, foreman for Blue Ridge Coal Company's Last Hope mine, the only operation still running in McDowell County. He'd been mining since he was 17, following his father and grandfather into the earth, breathing coal dust for 24 years in exchange for wages that used to mean something. Dale stood 5 feet 10 inches tall, built thick and solid from decades of physical labor, with a face that had seen too much darkness, literally and figuratively. He had a wife, Karen, and 3 daughters aged 16, 13, and 9. The mortgage on their house, in War, was 3 months behind. The electric company had sent a final notice. His oldest daughter wanted to go to college, but there was no money for that. No money for anything except surviving one more month. Working with Dale were 8 other men, all in their 30s and 40s, all with similar stories of economic desperation. Robert Lee Carson, 38, whose wife had cancer and needed treatments the insurance barely covered. James Michael Donnelly, 42, supporting his elderly mother and his sister's 3 kids after she died from an overdose. William Thomas Bradley, 35, who'd been injured in a roof collapse 2 years ago and worked through constant pain because disability wouldn't cover his bills. Marcus Anthony Wells, 39, trying to save enough to move his family out of West Virginia to somewhere with actual opportunity. Raymond Dale Foster, 41, whose son had cerebral palsy and needed equipment Medicaid wouldn't pay for. Anthony James Butler, 37, divorced, paying child support for 2 kids he barely saw. Stephen Robert Mitchell, 40, whose wife had left him and taken everything, working now just to pay off debts from the marriage. Christopher Lee Adams, 36, youngest of the group, engaged to be married, trying to save for a wedding while supporting his disabled father. These men worked 12-hour shifts deep underground in conditions that would horrify anyone who'd never been in a coal mine. The Last Hope mine was a shaft operation, meaning you descended 2,000 feet straight down in an elevator cage that shook and rattled, then worked in tunnels barely 4 feet high, crawling through darkness broken only by helmet lights, breathing air thick with coal dust, despite ventilation systems that barely functioned. The roof above you was held up by timber supports and roof bolts that groaned under the weight of mountain pressing down. Every shift carried the possibility of cave-in, explosion, equipment failure that could crush you or trap you or suffocate you in darkness 2,000 feet below sunlight. The work destroyed your body slowly. Black lung disease was inevitable if you worked long enough. Your knees went bad from crawling. Your back gave out from hunching. Your hearing failed from constant machinery noise. But in 1982, McDowell County, mining was the only work available that paid enough to keep a family fed. Blue Ridge Coal Company had been struggling for 3 years, cutting corners to stay profitable in a market flooded with cheap Western coal and foreign imports. In October 1982, management announced new shift schedules designed to maximize production while minimizing labor costs. The day shift, which had run from 7 in the morning to 5 in the evening, would now start at 6 and end at 6. 12-hour shifts instead of 10, no increase in pay. The justification was that longer shifts meant fewer shift changes, which meant less downtime, which meant the mine could stay open and the men could keep their jobs. Take it or leave it. For men like Dale Pritchard, who lived in war and had to drive 42 miles each way on mountain roads to reach the mine entrance near Bradshaw, the new schedule was devastating. Leave home at 5 in the morning when it was still dark. Drive an hour through mountains. Work 12 hours underground. Drive an hour home. Arrive at 7:30 at night, exhausted, filthy, with barely enough energy to eat dinner before collapsing into bed. Then wake at 4:30 the next morning and do it again, 6 days a week. 72 hours of work, plus 12 hours of driving. No time for family, no time for rest, no time for anything except survival. The route from war to the mine followed Route 16 south to Bradshaw, Then County Road 12 east, into the mountains, where the Last Hope shaft entrance sat in a hollow called Devil's Fork. The drive took between 65 minutes, depending on weather and traffic, though traffic was rare on these roads. But Dale Pritchard was a foreman, which meant he had responsibility for his crew, which meant he was always looking for ways to make their lives slightly less miserable. In mid-October, while driving home after a particularly brutal shift, he noticed a dirt road branching off County Road 12 about 8 miles before Devil's Fork. The road wasn't marked, barely visible through overgrown vegetation, but it clearly led northeast, which was the direction of war. Dale had lived in these mountains his entire life, knew that most old roads connected to other old roads in ways modern maps didn't show. He followed the dirt road on a hunch, drove 3 miles through increasingly dense forest, emerged onto a ridge road he recognized as being only 4 miles from war. The shortcut saved 35 minutes. 35 minutes that could mean an extra half hour of sleep in the morning, an extra half hour with family at night, precious time stolen back from a company that had taken everything else. Dale told his crew about the shortcut the next day. 8 men who lived in war or nearby hollows started using it immediately. The dirt road was rough but passable in the pickup trucks most miners drove. It ran through what appeared to be abandoned property, no buildings visible, no signs of recent activity, just old-growth forest and mountain ridges. About 2 miles in, the road widened slightly where it passed through a clearing on a flat section of ridge. The clearing was pretty in a stark mountain way, surrounded by oak and hickory trees, with a low stone wall visible through the undergrowth on the uphill side. None of the men paid much attention to the stone wall. It looked old, probably from some homestead that had been abandoned decades ago. Like so many others in these mountains, they were too tired to investigate, too focused on getting home to their families. They drove through the clearing, continued down the mountain, saved 35 minutes each way, and counted themselves lucky to have found a route that made their brutal schedule slightly more bearable. Thomas Harlow woke at 4:30 on the morning of October 23, 1982, like he did every morning, made his coffee, read his chapter from Genesis about Abraham preparing to sacrifice Isaac on ground God called holy, and stepped outside into darkness that smelled like coming winter. The temperature had dropped to 28 degrees overnight. Frost covered everything in a thin white sheet that crunched under his boots as he walked up the hill toward the cemetery. His breath was visible in the cold air. His knee ached from the old logging injury, making the walk slower than usual. By the time he reached the stone wall surrounding the family graves, the sky was beginning to lighten in the east, that pale gray that comes before dawn in the mountains. Thomas walked through the gap. In the wall that served as entrance, moved among the headstones the way a man might move through a room full of sleeping children, careful and reverent. He stopped first at Elizabeth's grave, then Sarah's, spoke to them quietly about small things, the weather turning cold, the firewood supply holding up, ordinary conversation with the dead that had been his morning ritual for 5 years. That's when he noticed the tire tracks, deep ruts cutting through the clearing just outside the stone wall, fresh enough that frost hadn't fully settled in them. Thomas stood very still, his mind processing what his eyes were seeing. The tracks came from the old logging road that ran down the mountain. The road his grandfather had cut in the 1890s to haul timber. The road hadn't been used in 20 years, was barely visible through the overgrowth, but someone had driven through recently, heavy vehicle based on the depth of the ruts, and they'd driven close enough to the cemetery that the passenger side tires had actually crossed onto the flat ground where graves lay beneath 3 inches of topsoil and 127 years of accumulated leaf litter. Thomas followed the tracks with his eyes, saw where they curved around the lower edge of the clearing, saw something else that made his chest tighten. Trash. A crushed beer can lying near his grandfather's headstone. A cigarette pack wedged against the base of the stone wall. A plastic bag caught in the branches of the oak tree that grew beside his mother's grave. Thomas walked slowly around the perimeter of the cemetery, his limp more pronounced now not from pain, but from the weight of what he was discovering. More tire tracks on the downhill side, pressed into the soft earth near the newer graves. A section of the stone wall had been knocked loose, 3 stones displaced, probably by someone backing up without looking. And then he saw the broken headstone, not completely destroyed, but cracked straight through the middle where something heavy had rolled over it. The headstone marked the grave of his daughter Sarah. The white marble he'd bought with 3 months' wages, the inscription he'd chosen so carefully, cracked in 2 pieces, with fresh tire marks pressed into the ground on either side. Thomas knelt beside the broken stone, touched the crack with fingers that had suddenly gone numb despite the cold. Someone had driven through his family cemetery, through sacred ground where 7-year-old Sarah lay buried, where his wife Elizabeth rested, where 5 generations of Harlows slept beneath the earth. And they'd done it carelessly, thoughtlessly, leaving trash and broken monuments like this was just another piece of worthless mountain land instead of the only holy ground his family possessed. Thomas spent the rest of that morning following the tire tracks, walking the 3 miles down the old logging road until it emerged onto County Road 12 near Devil's Fork. The tracks were consistent with heavy pickup trucks, the kind miners drove, and there were multiple sets of tracks suggesting several vehicles had used this route repeatedly. Thomas stood at the junction of the logging road and the county road, understanding gradually forming. The tracks headed northeast toward war. The timing made sense. Miners working at Last Hope Mine, looking for a shortcut home, stumbling onto the old logging road and using it without knowing or caring whose land they were crossing. Thomas drove his own truck to the Last Hope Mine that afternoon, arriving around 3 when the day shift was ending. He waited in the parking area near the mine entrance, a flat stretch of gravel where pickup trucks and a few older cars sat covered in coal dust. When the miners started emerging from the shaft elevator, black from head to toe, exhausted and bent, Thomas approached a group of men heading toward their trucks. He was calm, respectful, spoke quietly, asking if any of them had been using the old road through the hollow northeast of here. Several men looked uncomfortable. One spoke up. Tall man, early 40s, introduced himself as Dale Pritchard, foreman. Dale explained about the shift changes, the extended hours, the need to save time getting home. He said they'd found the old road a few weeks back, hadn't seen any no trespassing signs, thought it was abandoned property. Thomas listened without interrupting, then explained just as calmly that the land was private, had been in his family since 1855, and the clearing they were driving through was a cemetery where his ancestors were buried going back 5 generations. He showed Dale a photograph he'd brought, picture of the broken headstone with his daughter's name visible. He said he understood about hard work and long hours. His own father had been a miner, but he was asking respectfully that they stop using the road, find another route. Dale looked at the photograph for a long moment, then looked at Thomas, and Thomas saw genuine regret in the man's face. Dale apologized sincerely, said he had no idea, promised it wouldn't happen again, shook Thomas's hand. The conversation lasted maybe 10 minutes. Both men were polite, reasonable, speaking the language of mountain men who understood that some things were sacred even if the law didn't recognize them. Thomas drove home believing the problem was solved, believing that Dale Pritchard was a man of his word. The next morning, October 24th, Thomas walked up to the cemetery at his usual time and found fresh tire tracks. 2 sets this time from the previous evening based on the frost patterns. Another beer can near the stone wall, a cigarette butt ground into the dirt near Elizabeth's grave. Someone had driven through again, probably late afternoon after Thomas had spoken to Dale at the mine. November 1st, a week later, Thomas made the walk again and found the tracks had become routine. Multiple vehicles every evening, ruts getting deeper, more trash accumulating. On November 2nd, he discovered another damaged headstone, this one belonging to his grandfather, William, knocked askew by a vehicle that had gotten too close while turning around. And he found something else that made everything clear. A crumpled piece of paper wedged under a rock near the stone wall. A work schedule from Blue Ridge Coal Company showing the day shift hours, 6 in the morning to 6 at night, with names listed, 9 names. Dale Pritchard was at the top of the list. Thomas stood in the cemetery holding that piece of paper, understanding that his polite request had been ignored, that his warning had been laughed off, that these men had decided his family's sacred ground meant nothing compared to their convenience. Thomas called his 3 sons to the homestead on the evening of November 2nd, 1982. He didn't explain why over the phone, just said he needed them to come for dinner, bring their wives if they wanted, but this was family business that required discussion. Jacob arrived first with Rebecca and their 3 children. Matthew came alone from his cabin down the hill. Samuel showed up last, having driven from Bluefield, where he'd been working a carpentry job. They ate dinner around the kitchen table where Thomas's grandfather had eaten, where 4 generations of Harlows had made decisions about the land and the family and what both required. Martha had made pot roast with potatoes and carrots, the kind of meal that took hours to prepare and tasted like childhood, like continuity, like everything that mattered about family gathered in one place. After dinner, Rebecca took the children to the living room. Thomas poured coffee for his sons, strong and black, set the photographs on the table. Pictures of tire tracks cutting through the cemetery, pictures of the broken headstones, picture of trash accumulated around the graves. He told them about speaking to Dale Pritchard about the promise that had been broken, about finding the work schedule that proved the trespassing was deliberate and ongoing. The 4 men sat in silence for several minutes, drinking coffee, looking at the photographs. Finally, Thomas spoke, asking each son the same question. "What would your grandfather do?" Jacob answered first. Grandfather would have shot them the first time they crossed his land. Matthew said grandfather wouldn't have warned them at all, would have considered the violation itself sufficient cause for response. Samuel, youngest and most conflicted, said, maybe they should try the legal route first, call the sheriff, file trespassing charges. Thomas shook his head slowly. The sheriff's department was 40 minutes away, understaffed, wouldn't prioritize property disputes in a county where actual crimes went uninvestigated. Even if they prosecuted, the penalty for trespassing was a fine these men probably couldn't pay anyway, and prosecuting them wouldn't repair the broken headstones, wouldn't erase the tire tracks through Sarah's grave, wouldn't restore the sanctity that had been violated. The law couldn't protect what mattered here because the law had never recognized that a cemetery was more than property, that some ground was sacred, regardless of what county records or courthouse documents said. Thomas stood up from the table, walked to the window that overlooked the cemetery 200 yards uphill. His sons followed him with their eyes, but said nothing. He spoke quietly, telling them about his father standing in front of bulldozers in 1959, about the promise he'd made at his father's grave to never let anyone touch this ground. He said he'd tried the civilized approach, tried respect and reasonable conversation, and been shown that these men considered Harlow warnings meaningless. He turned back to face his sons, his eyes the color of coal smoke, holding calculations that had been made in the days since he'd found that work. Schedule. He told them they could walk away now, no shame in choosing another path. But he was going to defend what 5 generations of Harlows had protected. Not because he wanted violence, not because he was angry, but because some violations demanded response. And when the law couldn't protect what was sacred, mountain justice was all that remained. His sons looked at each other across the table where they'd eaten thousands of meals, where they'd learned what it meant to be Harlow men. Then, one by one, they nodded. November 3rd through 6th, 1982, the Harlow men prepared methodically for what was coming. They didn't discuss it in explicit terms, didn't sit around planning murder like criminals in some television drama. They simply moved through tasks that had been passed down through generations, skills their grandfather had taught them, knowledge that mountain families had accumulated over centuries of living in places where survival sometimes required violence. Thomas retrieved the hunting rifles from the locked cabinet in his bedroom. 3 Winchester Model 70 rifles in .30-06 caliber, weapons his father had used for deer hunting. Perfectly legal, perfectly common in Appalachian households. He cleaned each one carefully, breaking them down completely, scrubbing the barrels with solvent and running patches through until they came out white. He oiled the actions, checked the scopes, test-fired each rifle into the hillside behind his house to verify 0. The sound of gunshots echoed through the hollow, but nobody paid attention. November was deer season. Gunshots were as common as bird calls. Jacob and Matthew walked the old logging road, examining every foot of the 3-mile stretch that ran through Harlow property. They identified the optimal locations for what needed to happen, places where the road narrowed between trees, where sight lines were clear, where vehicles would have to slow down for curves. They noted the locations of abandoned mine shafts, remnants of old drift mines from the 1890s, when small operations had followed coal seams into the mountainside. The shafts were unmapped, forgotten by everyone except locals who'd grown up knowing which sections of mountain were dangerous. 3 shafts within a half-mile of the cemetery, their entrances partially collapsed, but still accessible, dropping down into darkness that no one had explored in decades. Perfect for making things disappear. They marked the locations in their minds, traced routes from the road to each shaft, calculated how long it would take to drag a body through forest at night. Matthew brought his tools from the cabin, the same tools he used for maintaining the cemetery. Ropes, shovels, tarps, a wheelbarrow with the wheel greased so it rolled silent. Samuel was the most reluctant, the one who kept suggesting alternatives even though he knew none would work. On November 4th, he drove to Bluefield to see his girlfriend Teresa, told her he might not be around for a while. Something had come up with family business. She asked what kind of business required him to look like he was attending a funeral before it happened. Samuel couldn't explain, could only hold her and memorize what her hair smelled like, what her voice sounded like when she said his name, because he understood that after what was coming, he might not be the same person she'd fallen in love with. He drove back to the hollow that night, found his father and brothers sitting on the porch in the cold dark, drinking coffee and smoking cigarettes, not talking, just being present together, the way men do when words are insufficient. Samuel sat with them, accepting his place in what they were about to become. Not because he believed it was right, but because he believed his family was right. And sometimes those two things couldn't coexist peacefully. Thomas spent November 5th reading his grandfather's journal, leather-bound book from the 1880s, filled with cramped handwriting that documented the early years on this land. His grandfather had written about defending the property from timber thieves in 1889, about 3 men who'd tried to cut trees without permission, about what happened to them in language that was oblique but clear enough. Sometimes a man has to become what he fears to protect what he loves, his grandfather had written. The law is made by people far away who don't understand these mountains. Here, a man's word and a man's ground are all he has. Take those away, and you take his humanity. Thomas copied that passage into his own journal, adding beneath it, November 6th, 1982. 9 men have violated sacred ground despite warning. The law cannot help. Tomorrow we become what we must. God forgive us for knowing exactly what we do. He closed the journal, placed it in the drawer where his grandfather's journal had lived for 40 years, and walked upstairs to wake his sons before dawn. It was time. November 6th was a Saturday, which meant no work shifts at Last Hope Mine, which meant the miners wouldn't be driving through the hollow that evening. The Harlows used the day for final preparations, moving with the quiet efficiency of men who'd made peace with their decision. Thomas walked to the cemetery at dawn like always, but this morning he brought tools. He and his sons repaired the damaged sections of stone wall, replaced the broken headstones with temporary wooden crosses that Matthew had carved from oak, cleared away all the trash that had accumulated over 3 weeks of violations. They worked in silence, restoring the cemetery to the condition it had been in before the trespassers came, erasing the visible evidence of desecration even though the spiritual wound remained. When they finished, Thomas stood at the center of the graves, His sons gathered around him and spoke a prayer, not asking for forgiveness because he didn't believe what they were about to do required forgiveness, asking instead for strength, for resolve, for the courage to see it through completely, because half measures would dishonor the dead more than doing nothing at all. That afternoon they prepared the logging road. Matthew set bear traps in 3 locations along the route, massive steel traps with teeth designed to hold a black bear, strong enough to destroy a tire and disable a vehicle instantly. He buried them under a thin layer of dirt and leaves, positioned them where vehicles would naturally drive based on the rut patterns from previous weeks. Jacob strung rope across the road at 2 locations, thin rope at neck height that would be invisible at night, tied to trees on either side, ready to be deployed when needed. Samuel, despite his reluctance, walked the routes to the mine shafts repeatedly until he could navigate them in complete darkness without stumbling. They cached supplies at each location, shovels and ropes hidden under tarps, everything positioned for quick access. They weren't trying to make this look like an accident. They were simply being practical about disposal, about making sure 9 bodies could disappear completely into mountains that had swallowed countless other things over the centuries. Evening fell early in November, darkness coming by 5:30. The temperature dropped to 24 degrees. Thomas cooked dinner for his sons, venison stew with potatoes, the last meal they'd eat as innocent men. Nobody talked much. Jacob's hands shook slightly when he lifted his coffee cup. Matthew stared at the wall, his mind somewhere else entirely. Samuel excused himself twice to vomit in the bathroom, his body rejecting what his mind had accepted. Thomas remained steady, drawing strength from the certainty that what they were about to do was necessary, that his grandfather would have done the same, that the dead buried up the hill required this of the living. After dinner, he opened his Bible to Ecclesiastes chapter 3, read aloud the verses about there being a time for everything, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time for war and a time for peace. He closed the book, looked at each of his sons in turn, told them one final time they could walk away. This was his decision, his burden. They didn't have to carry it with him. Jacob spoke first, saying he was Harlow, which meant this was his burden too. Matthew said their grandfather had taught them that family means carrying weight together, not letting the old man bear it alone. Samuel said nothing for a long moment, then stood and retrieved his rifle from where it leaned against the wall, checked that it was loaded, and that was answer enough. They left the house at 8 in the evening, 4 men carrying hunting rifles and flashlights, walking up the logging road in darkness, broken only by stars, visible between bare branches. They positioned themselves at intervals along the route, Thomas and Jacob at the upper and near the cemetery, Matthew and Samuel at the lower end, near County Road 12. They were hunting now, not deer but men, waiting in freezing darkness for headlights to appear on the road below, knowing that when those lights came, everything would change, that the line between guardian and killer was about to be crossed, and that once crossed, there would be no way back. The headlights appeared at 6:45 in the evening, 2 vehicles climbing the old logging road from County Road 12. Sunday evening, shift work at Last Hope Mine ran 7 days a week now, production schedules that ignored weekends. 3 miners in the lead truck, Dale Pritchard driving, Robert Carson riding passenger, James Donnelly in the back seat. All three exhausted from 12 hours underground, faces still streaked with coal dust. They'd washed off as best they could in the mine's shower facilities. They were talking about the upcoming Thanksgiving holiday, 4 weeks away, whether the mine would shut down for the day or force them to work through it. Dale was saying he hoped for shutdown because his oldest daughter had a school play that Wednesday night he wanted to attend. Ordinary conversation, tired men thinking about ordinary things, completely unaware they were driving toward men with rifles who'd been waiting in the dark for 2 hours. The front tire hit the bear trap at exactly 6:52. The trap's jaws snapped closed with a sound like a gunshot, steel teeth punching through rubber and rim. The entire front end of the truck dropping as the tire exploded. Dale fought the steering wheel, managed to keep the truck from rolling, brought it to a stop halfway across the narrow road at an angle that blocked both lanes. The three men sat stunned for a moment, then Dale swore and killed the engine. They climbed out slowly, stiff from the long shift, walked around to examine the damage. The front driver's side tire was shredded, the rim bent beyond repair, and something was clearly wrong because the axle was sitting too low. Dale knelt to look closer, pulled out his flashlight, saw the massive bear trap clamped around the wheel assembly. He said something about how the hell did that get here, starting to stand back up, and that's when the first shot cracked through the cold air. The bullet took Robert Carson in the chest, center mass, professional shot from 60 yards away. He went down without a sound, dead before his body hit the ground. Dale and James Donnelly froze for maybe 2 seconds, their minds trying to process what had just happened. Then both men ran. James went downhill toward where they'd come from, Dale uphill toward the cemetery. 2 more shots, spaced 3 seconds apart, both finding their targets. James made it maybe 40 yards before the bullet caught him between the shoulder blades, punching through spine and lung, dropping him face first into leaves and dirt. Dale made it almost to the stone wall before his knee exploded, the bullet shattering his kneecap, sending him sprawling onto ground that held 127 years of Harlow dead. He was screaming now, pain and terror, crawling with his hands, trying to drag himself over the stone wall as if that would save him. Thomas Harlow walked out of the darkness, rifle held ready, and stood looking down at Dale Pritchard, crawling through dirt beside Sarah's grave. Thomas didn't speak, didn't explain, didn't offer justification. He simply raised the rifle and fired once more, the bullet entering the base of Dale's skull, silencing the screaming instantly. Then he stood in the darkness, breathing cold air that smelled like gunpowder, looking at 3 bodies scattered across ground he'd warned them not to cross. Jacob emerged from the trees, followed by Matthew and Samuel running uphill from their positions. The 4 Harlow men stood together in silence, the enormity of what they'd just done settling over them like physical weight. Samuel vomited into the bushes. Matthew's hands were shaking badly enough that he had to set his rifle down. Jacob looked at his father, his face asking the question none of them could voice. Thomas checked his watch. 7:04. They had hours of darkness left. He told his sons to get the wheelbarrow and ropes. They had bodies to move, and 6 more miners who'd be coming through tomorrow night. The work had just begun. They worked through the night of November 7th into early morning November 8th, dragging the 3 bodies to the nearest abandoned mine shaft, a drift mine entrance about 300 yards northeast of the cemetery. The shaft angled downward at 45 degrees, dropping into darkness that their flashlights couldn't penetrate fully. They could see maybe 50 feet down before the beam disappeared into black. The shaft was maybe 4 feet wide, the walls shored up with timber that had rotted over 90 years, the floor covered in debris and standing water at the bottom. Thomas and Jacob dragged Dale Pritchard's body to the entrance while Matthew and Samuel brought Robert Carson. They pushed the bodies over the edge one at a time, listened to them slide and tumble down the shaft, heard the splash when they hit water at the bottom. James Donnelly's body followed. Then they spent an hour collapsing part of the entrance, using shovels and pry bars to bring down enough timber and rock to partially seal the shaft, making it look like natural deterioration rather than deliberate concealment. By the time they finished, dawn was breaking, and they walked back to Thomas's house in silence, 4 men covered in dirt and blood, carrying rifles and guilt in equal measure. That evening, November 8th, 6 more miners came through the hollow in 2 vehicles, William Bradley, Marcus Wells, and Raymond Foster in 1 truck, Anthony Butler, Stephen Mitchell, and Christopher Adams in another. They hit the second bear trap at 7:15, both trucks stopping to investigate what they assumed was an accident like the previous night. They'd heard at work that morning about Dale and his crew not showing up, assumed they'd called in sick or had car trouble. Never imagined they'd been murdered on this same road 24 hours earlier. The 6 men climbed out of their trucks, standing in the narrow road with flashlights, examining the trap, starting to realize this wasn't an accident when the shooting started. 4 rifles firing from darkness, controlled fire, professional execution. William Bradley died instantly, bullet through his throat. Marcus Wells tried to run, made it 15 feet before 2 bullets caught him in the back. Raymond Foster attempted to take cover behind his truck, spent maybe 30 seconds hiding before Thomas Harlow walked around the vehicle and shot him point blank in the head. Anthony Butler, Stephen Mitchell, and Christopher Adams ran downhill together, staying close, thinking maybe numbers would save them. Matthew and Samuel were positioned for exactly this scenario. The thin rope strung across the road at neck height, tied to trees on both sides, normally hanging loose and invisible. As the 3 miners ran past in the darkness, Matthew and Samuel pulled the rope tight at exactly the right moment. Anthony Butler hit it at a dead run, the rope catching him across the throat with enough force to flip him backward, his head striking a rock, skull fracturing, death almost instant. Stephen Mitchell and Christopher Adams managed to stop, turned to run back uphill, ran directly into Jacob's firing line. 2 shots, both clean, both men down within seconds. The entire encounter lasted maybe 3 minutes from first shot to last. 9 bodies now, 3 from the night before, 6 tonight, all needing to be moved to mine shafts and hidden before dawn. The Harlow men worked through another night, dragging bodies through forest, pushing them into darkness, collapsing entrances covering tracks. By dawn on November 9th, 9 miners were gone, swallowed by mountains that had swallowed countless other secrets, and the hollow was silent again, except for wind moving through bare branches and the distant sound of something settling deep underground. November 10th, 1982. Blue Ridge Coal Company's Last Hope Mine, opened for the day shift at 6 in the morning, but 9 men didn't show up for work. The mine supervisor, Gerald Thompson, wasn't initially concerned. Miners called in sick frequently. Equipment breakdowns happened, personal emergencies arose. But by 7:30, when none of the 9 had called and none could be reached by phone, concern turned to alarm. Dale Pritchard was the foreman, reliable as sunrise, hadn't missed a shift in 6 years. The fact that he and 8 others had vanished simultaneously suggested something catastrophic. Gerald called the McDowell County Sheriff's Department at 8:15, reported 9 missing miners last seen leaving work the previous evening. Around 6, Sheriff Billy Ray Carson, no relation to Robert Carson, dispatched 2 deputies to begin checking the route from the mine to war, looking for accident scenes, disabled vehicles, any sign of what might have happened to 9 men driving home on mountain roads. The deputies found the first vehicle at 11:30 that morning, Dale Pritchard's pickup truck, sitting abandoned on the old logging road that cut through Harlow Hollow. The front tire was destroyed. Caught in what appeared to be a bear trap, the vehicle positioned at an angle blocking the road. No sign of the occupants. Blood on the ground near the driver's side door. Shell casings from .30-06 rifles scattered in the dirt. The deputies immediately called for backup, recognizing this wasn't an accident or a breakdown, but a crime scene. By 2 in the afternoon, 12 law enforcement officers were searching the hollow. State police had been notified, and the FBI field office in Charleston had been alerted about potential multiple homicides. They found the second and third vehicles a quarter-mile down the logging road, both with destroyed tires from bear traps, both abandoned with blood evidence nearby. More shell casings, drag marks leading into the forest. The search expanded to include tracking dogs and helicopter support, officers combing through dense woodland, looking for bodies or survivors. Thomas Harlow was home when the police arrived at his door at 4:30 that afternoon. 3 state troopers and 2 county deputies asking if he'd heard or seen anything unusual in the past 2 days. Thomas invited them inside, offered coffee, answered every question calmly and honestly. Yes, he owned this land, had for 5 generations. Yes, he knew about the old logging road, hadn't used it himself in 20 years. Didn't know anyone was driving through regularly. No, he hadn't heard gunshots, but November was deer season. Gunshots were constant background noise in these mountains. No, he hadn't seen any vehicles or strange activity. He allowed them to search his property without warrant, walked them through his house and outbuildings, showed them his rifles, all properly stored and recently cleaned because he'd been deer hunting 2 days ago. The officers found nothing suspicious. Thomas was cooperative, respectful, gave them permission to search anywhere they wanted. They searched the cemetery, photographed the stone wall and headstones, found nothing indicating recent disturbance because the Harlows had carefully restored everything after the killings. The search continued for 3 weeks. Hundreds of man-hours, officers and volunteers, combing every foot of the hollow, following every trail, searching every abandoned structure. They found shell casings, blood evidence, drag marks, but no bodies. The old mine shafts were known hazards in McDowell County, dozens of them scattered through the mountains, most unmapped, many partially collapsed. Search teams checked the obvious ones near the logging road, lowered cameras into accessible shafts, found nothing. The 3 shafts where the Harlow men had hidden bodies were either overlooked or dismissed as too collapsed to explore safely. By early December, the official search was suspended. 9 miners declared missing, presumed dead, but without bodies, there could be no murder charges, only suspicion and speculation. The families held memorial services without caskets, grieving men they knew were dead but couldn't properly bury. Blue Ridge Coal Company paid death benefits after 6 months, closed Last Hope Mine in March of 1983, citing safety concerns and declining profitability. McDowell County lost its last major employer, unemployment hit 53%, and 9 families learned to live with absence where fathers and husbands used to be. March 19th, 1983. A hiker named Dennis Crawford from Bluefield decided to explore some of the abandoned mine workings in the mountains northeast of Harland. Dennis was an amateur historian, interested in documenting the old coal operations before they disappeared completely. He was photographing a drift mine entrance about half a mile from Harlow Hollow when he noticed the entrance had been recently disturbed, dirt and rock that didn't match the weathering patterns of 90-year-old collapse. He cleared some of the debris, shined his flashlight down the shaft, and saw something that made him immediately hike back to his car and call the state police. Fabric visible about 40 feet down what looked like a boot. The smell of decomposition even in cold mountain air. State police arrived with technical rescue teams, spent 2 days carefully excavating the shaft entrance, and eventually recovered 3 badly decomposed bodies. Dale Pritchard, Robert Carson, and James Donnelly, identified through dental records and personal effects. The discovery triggered renewed investigation, focused search of other mine shafts in the immediate area, and by June of 1983, all 9 bodies had been recovered from 3 different locations. The FBI took over the investigation, bringing resources and expertise the local sheriff's department couldn't match. Special Agent Raymond Cross from the Charleston Field Office led the case. 43-year-old veteran with 20 years of experience investigating violent crimes in Appalachia. He understood these mountains, understood the codes and grudges and generational feuds that modern law enforcement manuals didn't cover. The evidence was overwhelming. Ballistics matched the bullets recovered from bodies to .30-06 rifles, extremely common in the region. The bear traps were old style, the kind that had been illegal for decades, but still existed in rural households. The bodies showed evidence of professional execution, shots placed with accuracy that suggested military or extensive hunting experience. Agent Cross started interviewing locals, asking about grudges, disputes, anyone who might have motive to kill 9 coal miners. Multiple people mentioned the Harlow family, the old logging road through their property, rumors that miners had been using it as a shortcut. Some mentioned seeing Thomas Harlow at the mine weeks before the disappearances, speaking to Dale Pritchard. The pieces assembled slowly, methodically into a picture that pointed clearly toward 4 men who'd lived on that land for 127 years. On August 4, 1983, FBI agents arrested Thomas Harlow and his 3 sons simultaneously at dawn, executing warrants for 9 counts of first-degree murder each. The Harlows didn't resist, didn't run, didn't claim innocence. Thomas asked only if he could walk to the cemetery one final time before they took him. The agents agreed, watched him climb the hill slowly, his limp pronounced in the cold morning air, kneel beside graves that held his wife and daughter and 5 generations of ancestors. He stayed there for 10 minutes, speaking quietly to the dead, then walked back down and allowed himself to be handcuffed without protest. At the FBI field office in Charleston, Agent Cross interviewed each Harlow separately. The son said nothing, invoked their right to attorneys, refused to answer questions. But Thomas Harlow, after sitting in silence for 3 hours, began to talk. He confessed completely, gave detailed descriptions of the planning, the execution, the disposal of bodies. He took full responsibility, claimed his sons had only been following his orders, tried to shield them from consequences, even though everyone knew that was impossible. The trial began in March 1984, held in the McDowell County Courthouse with security measures normally reserved for organized crime cases. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, physical and testimonial, painting the Harlows as cold-blooded killers who'd murdered 9 innocent men for trespassing. The defense tried to argue provocation, claimed the miners had desecrated sacred ground despite warnings, suggested the Harlows had acted to defend property rights in a region where law enforcement was essentially absent. The jury, 12 residents of McDowell County who understood mountain codes even if they couldn't legally condone them, deliberated for 6 days. On April 2, 1984, they returned guilty verdicts on all counts for all 4 defendants. The judge, Harold Meadows, 71 years old and 34 years on the bench, sentenced Thomas Harlow to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Jacob, Matthew, and Samuel each received 25 years to life, eligible for parole after serving minimum sentences. At sentencing, Judge Meadows said the Harlows had crossed a line no civilized society could tolerate, that property rights, even sacred ones, could never justify taking human life, that their actions had destroyed 18 families, 9 through death and 9 through imprisonment and grief. Thomas listened without expression, asked only if his sons could serve their time in West Virginia so family could visit. The request was granted. Thomas William Harlow died on July 3, 2019, at Federal Correctional Institution Hazleton in Brewston Mills, West Virginia. He was 95 years old, had served 35 years of his life sentence, and passed quietly in the prison medical facility from complications of pneumonia. His body was returned to McDowell County, buried in the family cemetery on the ridge above the hollow where 127 years of Harlow's rested. His granddaughter Elizabeth Harlow, 54 years old, and daughter of Jacob, maintained the cemetery now. She'd been 9 years old when her father was arrested, had grown up visiting him in prison, had inherited the family obligation to protect the graves even though that obligation had destroyed her childhood. Elizabeth lived in a trailer at the base of the hollow, worked as a nurse at the hospital in Bluefield, spent her weekends tending 46 headstones now that her grandfather had joined the ancestors he'd killed to protect. She understood what he'd done was wrong by any legal or moral standard, but she also understood that the cemetery represented something law couldn't recognize, that her family's entire identity was bound up in this ground in ways outsiders could never comprehend. Jacob Harlow was paroled in March 2008 after serving 24 years, his parole granted partly because of good behavior and partly because he was 56 years old and no longer considered a threat to society. He returned to the Hollow, built a small cabin on the lower section of the property, lived there alone because Rebecca had divorced him in 1991, and his children were scattered across 3 states, none willing to return to the place that had taken their father. Matthew Harlow was paroled in November 2011 after serving 27 years, moved into the cabin with his brother, worked odd jobs in Welch and Bluefield, spoke rarely about the years in prison or the night that had put him there. Samuel Harlow, youngest of the sons, was paroled in June 2014 at age 58, joined his brothers in the Hollow. The 3 men lived together, aging and damaged, tending the cemetery that had cost them everything, maintaining a covenant with the dead that had destroyed the living. They rarely left the property, kept to themselves, existed in a kind of suspended time where 1982 was always present, always demanding justification they couldn't provide. The 9 miners' families received settlements from a wrongful death lawsuit against the Harlow family in 1986. The court awarded $2 million total to be divided among the families, though the Harlows had no assets beyond the 40 acres and a house worth maybe $30,000. The land couldn't be seized because it was protected under a 19th century homestead law that prevented forced sale of ancestral property. The families eventually received $23,000 each from the sale of timber rights and mineral rights, money that couldn't begin to compensate for husbands and fathers lost. Dale Pritchard's oldest daughter never attended college, worked retail in war until the town died completely, moved to Charleston where she lived on disability. Robert Carson's wife died of cancer in 1997, the cancer that had been treatable if they'd had his income and insurance. James Donnelly's sister's 3 children grew up in foster care after she overdosed in 1985, scattered across the state, none maintaining contact with each other. The generational damage rippled forward through decades, destroying futures that had barely begun. Blue Ridge Coal Company declared bankruptcy in July 1987, citing declining coal prices, increased environmental regulations, and the loss of workforce after the murders. The Last Hope mine was permanently sealed in 1989, the entrance filled with concrete, the surface buildings demolished. The property was purchased by a land trust in 1995, declared a brownfield site contaminated by decades of coal mining, left to slowly heal over generations. McDowell County's population dropped from 50,000 in 1982 to 18,000 by 2024, half of what it had been. The young people left. The coal industry never recovered. The towns that had sustained these mountains for a century became ghost towns where buildings collapsed and streets grew over with weeds. War, where most of the 9 miners had lived, was officially dissolved as a municipality in 2003, population down to 138. The hollow where the Harlows lived remained isolated, a place locals knew but avoided, the kind of location that accumulated stories and superstitions, where people claimed they could feel something wrong in the air, even if they didn't know the history. The story of the Harlow family murders became legend in Appalachia, a cautionary tale told to illustrate lessons nobody could quite articulate clearly. Don't trespass on mountain land. Don't disrespect what others hold sacred. Don't underestimate what desperate men will do when pushed. Don't assume modern law has replaced older codes that still govern in forgotten places. The murders represented a collision between worlds, between men who thought convenience justified cutting through private property and men who believed some ground was holy regardless of what contemporary society recognized. Neither side was entirely wrong. The miners needed shortcuts to make impossible schedules bearable in an economy that had abandoned them. The Harlows needed to protect what 5 generations had consecrated with their bodies. But the collision produced 9 corpses and 4 destroyed lives, and 18 families shattered across 2 generations, and nobody won, and nothing was protected. And the only thing accomplished was proof that violence breeds more violence, regardless of justification. Former FBI Special Agent Raymond Cross retired in 2010 after 33 years of service. In a 2020 podcast interview about the Harlow case, he said, "Legally, Thomas Harlow was a mass murderer. He killed 9 men in cold blood with premeditation and planning. But morally, he was defending something sacred in the only way the system left available to him. The law couldn't protect a family cemetery from trespassing, couldn't recognize that some property is holy ground, couldn't provide remedy for desecration that mattered more than physical damage. So Thomas Harlow became judge, jury, and executioner, and 9 men died for the crime of being tired and taking a shortcut. I've lived with that contradiction for 40 years. Still don't have an answer that satisfies me. Sometimes the law is clear, but morality is messier, and the Harlow case sits right in that impossible space where both can't coexist." Retired Judge Harold Meadows, who'd sentenced the Harlows, died in 2016 at age 103. His private papers donated to West Virginia University included notes about the case that were never made public during his lifetime. One passage read, "The Harlows violated every principle of civilized society." But they lived in a place where civilization had failed, where the law was 40 minutes away and wouldn't have helped anyway, where 5 generations of ancestors demanded protection and modern courts couldn't recognize that demand as legitimate. I sentenced them correctly. I also understand why they did it. Both things are true. The question the Harlow murders force us to confront is simple in statement but impossible in answer. At what point does protecting what we hold sacred transform us into the very thing we're fighting against? Thomas Harlow believed he was defending holy ground, maintaining a covenant with the dead that defined his family's entire existence. But in defending that ground, he became a killer, destroyed his sons' lives, ensured the cemetery would be maintained by traumatized descendants who associated it with horror rather than heritage. The miners believed they were just trying to survive, finding small efficiencies in a system designed to crush them. But in taking that shortcut without permission, they violated something sacred, ignored a warning from a man who tried to reason with them, triggered a tragedy that could have been avoided with basic respect. Neither side was evil. Both sides were human, trapped in circumstances that offered no good options, making choices that made sense from their perspectives, but looked like madness from outside. And that's the most disturbing aspect of this story, because it means any of us might make similar choices if pushed far enough, if what we valued most was threatened, if the systems meant to protect us had completely failed. Was Thomas Harlow a murderer? Yes. He killed 9 men with premeditation and planning, executed them without trial, without mercy, some while they ran in terror through mountain darkness. He transformed his sons into killers, destroying their futures along with his own, ensuring his grandchildren would grow up ashamed of the family name. Was he a desperate guardian defending sacred ground? Also, yes. He'd tried the civilized approach, asked politely for respect, been ignored and laughed at. He protected what 5 generations had died to establish, maintained a covenant that modern society couldn't recognize, but mountain culture understood completely. The uncomfortable truth is both things can be true simultaneously, and that's what makes this case impossible to dismiss as simple criminality or simple justice. It exists in the space between, where law and morality diverge, where protection becomes destruction, where love becomes hate without changing form. If this story made you think about sacred ground, about the price we pay when systems fail us, about where the line between guardian and monster gets drawn, leave your like and share this video. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories that challenge what we think we know about right and wrong, about law and mountain justice, about how far ordinary people will go when everything they value is threatened. Comment below. What would you have done in Thomas Harlow's position? Where do you draw the line between protecting what's yours and becoming what you fear? Because these stories aren't just history. They're happening right now somewhere in forgotten counties where the system has failed and desperation takes hold and ordinary people make choices they can never take back. The names change, the circumstances evolve, but the fundamental question remains: what are we willing to become to protect what we love? Until next time, remember the monsters we fear aren't always born that way. Sometimes they're made. One desecrated grave, one ignored warning, one desperate November night at a time. And the line between sacred ground and killing ground is drawn not in law books or courthouse records, but in the human heart, where it's always been thinnest, always been easiest to cross, always been hardest to find our way back from.